Have you ever noticed someone who can't just say no and leave it at that? They say no, then they explain why, then they explain the explanation, then they apologize for explaining. By the end, the other person forgot what the original question even was. And the worst part, the person who over-explained knows exactly what happened. They watched themselves do it in real time and still couldn't stop. In a world that rewards confidence and directness, this behavior looks like a flaw. But psychology says it is not random. It is not simple insecurity. It is not a personality defect. It reveals something much deeper about how a nervous system learned to survive. And today, we are going to name it. Because naming a thing is the first step to no longer being controlled by it. We will look at 5 psychological layers behind this behavior. And by the end, the way you see yourself or someone you love will be permanently different. 1. Their brain learned, very early, that silence is dangerous. Psychologists say that over-explaining almost never starts in adulthood. It starts in childhood. Specifically, it starts in environments where not explaining yourself had real consequences. Maybe there was a parent who assumed the worst when you went quiet. Maybe silence meant punishment, or conflict, or being misunderstood in ways that hurt for days afterward. So the child's brain made a logical decision. If I explain everything clearly enough, I can prevent the bad thing from happening. Research on childhood emotional environments shows that when a child consistently feels responsible for managing how adults perceive them, they develop what psychologists call hypervigilance around communication. The nervous system stays permanently on alert, always scanning, always checking. Is this person confused? Are they upset? Are they about to withdraw? And the fastest way to quiet that alert? More words. This is why people who over-explain often feel a strange discomfort after giving a short answer. Not because the short answer was wrong, but because their body is still waiting for a consequence that never arrived. The behavior made perfect sense once. It just never received the signal the danger had passed. 2. Underneath the explaining, there is a fear most people never name out loud. It is not exactly the fear of being judged. It is something more specific than that. It is the fear of being misunderstood and not getting the chance to correct it. Psychologists link this to something called rejection sensitivity. People with high rejection sensitivity don't just fear being rejected. They fear that one misread moment, one sentence taken out of context, one wrong impression could cost them a relationship, a job, someone's trust. And once that fear is active, the brain does something very precise. It tries to pre-solve every possible misinterpretation before it can happen. So instead of saying, "I can't make it tonight," they say, "I can't make it tonight, and I know that might seem like I'm avoiding you, which I'm not. It's just that I have this other thing, and I actually really wanted to come, but the timing just doesn't work, and I hope you understand." Every extra sentence is a patch on a hole that might not even exist. Research shows this pattern is especially strong in people who grew up in unpredictable emotional environments, where the same behavior could be met with warmth one day and cold silence the next. When you cannot predict how someone will react, you learn to over-communicate. Because more information feels like more control, and control feels like safety. 3. There is a trauma response underneath this that most people have never heard of. Most people know the 3 classic stress responses: fight, flight, freeze. But psychologists have identified a 4th. It is called fawning, and over-explaining is one of its most common and least recognized expressions. Fawning is what happens when the nervous system decides that the safest response to a threat is not to fight it, not to run from it, not to freeze in front of it, but to make the other person comfortable, to manage their emotions before they can manage yours, to smooth everything over before conflict can even begin. People who fawn don't argue back. They don't go silent. They talk. They explain. They justify. They reassure. Think of it like an alarm system. It was installed after a real fire. And it did an excellent job. It protected a great deal. But the fire is long gone. The house was rebuilt. And the alarm still goes off every time someone lights a candle. The problem is not the alarm. The alarm did exactly what it was built to do. The problem is that it was never recalibrated for the current environment. Your nervous system is that alarm. It was programmed in a place where explaining yourself made sense, where not justifying your actions had real consequences, where other people's approval was, in some way, a matter of emotional survival. And it is doing exactly what it learned to do. But you are no longer in that environment. Research links fawning directly to early experiences where expressing a need clearly led to disconnection, criticism, or emotional punishment. The child learns, if I make myself easy to understand, easy to be around, easy to accept, I am safe. That lesson becomes automatic. And automatic behaviors do not ask for permission before they run. This is why people who over-explain feel a genuine wave of relief when the other person seems to understand. Not because the information was important, but because the threat in their body's language has temporarily passed. The explanation was never really about communication. It was about safety, or their internal meter for enough was never built. Here's something that researchers consistently find about people who over-explain. They almost never feel like they have said enough, even when the other person clearly understood. Even when the conversation is moved on, there is still a voice asking, but did they really get it? Psychologists call this an internal validation deficit. It means the person cannot fully trust external signals of acceptance. Someone nods and says, totally makes sense. And instead of registering that as confirmation, the over-explainer's brain treats it as uncertain data. Maybe they were just being polite. Maybe they didn't really understand. Maybe I should add one more thing just to be sure. This connects directly to early experiences where reassurance was inconsistent. When a parent's approval came and went without clear reason, the child stops trusting the moments of approval. They begin chasing a certainty that never quite arrives. So the explaining continues, not because the message is unclear, but because the person delivering it has no internal signal that says, this is enough, you are safe, you can stop now. That signal was never installed. And without it, the default is always more. This is where the practical work becomes essential, because you cannot solve this with willpower. Telling yourself, I will stop over-explaining, is like telling the alarm to stop ringing without ever recalibrating it. It works for a moment. And then the next conversation arrives, and the system runs on its own again. What actually works is creating a pause between the impulse and the action. Therapists call this expanding your window of tolerance. It is the space between feeling the urge to explain and acting on it. In that space, you can ask yourself one question. Is this explanation for information or is it for defense? If it is to inform, speak. If it is to defend against a threat that may not exist, wait. Not suppress. Not ignore. Just wait. And notice what happens. Most of the time, nothing bad happens. And the nervous system receives a small, quiet piece of new data. The room was safe. The short answer was enough. Over time, with repetition, the alarm begins to recalibrate. 5. The part of you that over-explains is not your enemy, it is your protector. This is the piece that most people never reach. And it is the most important one. Over-explaining is not a flaw. It is a loyalty. A loyalty to a version of yourself that once lived in a place where being misunderstood had real costs. That part learned to talk more, justify more, defend more. Because at some point, that was the intelligent thing to do. Psychologists who study nervous system adaptation are clear about this. Behaviors that appear self-defeating from the outside almost always made perfect sense in the original environment. The problem is not the behavior itself. The problem is when it travels into new environments where the threat no longer exists. And this is the part that requires something harder than willpower. It requires learning to tolerate the discomfort of ambiguity. Because underneath all the over-explaining, there is one thing it is always trying to eliminate. The possibility of being misunderstood. And that possibility will never reach zero. No matter how many words you use, no matter how perfect the explanation, there will always be a margin where another person constructs their own interpretation. That is not a failure of communication. That is what it means to be human. The real work is not to explain better. It is to slowly build a tolerance for the fact that not everyone will understand you perfectly and that you will be okay anyway. One conversation at a time. one short answer at a time. One moment of letting the silence exist without filling it. When you feel the urge to continue talking after the point has already been made, try something small. Close your mouth. Breathe. Then ask the other person a question. Not to deflect, but to create a moment of genuine connection instead of a monologue of defense. Asking is the opposite of over-explaining. Asking says, I trust that you understood enough for us to continue this together. That is a small act of courage, but it is the kind of courage that recalibrates an alarm. One conversation at a time, so let's bring all of this together. You are not someone who talks too much because you lack discipline. You are someone whose nervous system built a sophisticated protection system in a specific environment, for specific reasons, at a time when it genuinely kept you safe. Your brain learned that silence carries risk, that misunderstanding leads to loss, that more words create more control, and more control creates something that feels like safety. That system never stopped running. Even after the original threat was gone, even after you entered rooms where people do not assume the worst when you go quiet, even after you became someone who no longer needs that level of protection, the work is not to silence the part of you that over-explains. The work is to update it, to give it new information, to show it, slowly, through lived experience rather than intellectual argument, that the room has changed. That some people will not leave because you trusted them with fewer words. That a simple answer does not require a trial. That you do not need to earn your place in a conversation every single time. You were not given too many words. You were given a nervous system that learned to use words as shields. And shields can be set down. Not all at once. Not through force. But slowly, deliberately, in the rooms that have proven themselves safe enough. If something in this felt less like new information and more like something you already knew but had never heard said plainly, that recognition matters. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want to understand more about why your nervous system works the way it does and what you can do about it practically, the next video is waiting for you here. See you there.